Right. Welcome, everybody. My name is Henry Hale. I'm professor of political science and international affairs here at George Washington University and its Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. That program, our institute, together with its Petrock program on Ukraine, are very pleased to have with us today Eugene Fishel to present his new book, The Moscow Factor. You can hold it up if you want. So yeah, well, I guess it's up there. But, yeah, it does in hard copy.
Too kind.
Yeah, U.S. policy.
Let's see what you think afterwards.
So I suspect to most of us here in the room, many of us in the room, Gene needs no introduction, but let me go ahead and introduce him anyway. So he is a 30-year veteran of the Department of State. Amazing how time flies. Yeah, with a focus on the larger region involving Ukraine, Russia, and other surrounding countries. He's currently Distinguished Fellow at the Center for Security Policy Studies at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. And he served, among other things, as Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs at the National Security Council, Special Advisor to the Vice President of National Security Affairs, and Assistant National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasian at the National Intelligence Council of the NIC. So again, there's a lot more that could be said. I've had the pleasure of knowing Gene and sharing, learning from him over many years, I think since at least 2004. And so I think without further ado, let me turn things over to Gene. He'll talk for a while, present the book, and then we'll just open it up for general discussion based on whatever interests you related to the topic at hand. So
Henry, thank you so much. Thank you. I appreciate the kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. I see a few familiar faces in the audience, so very much appreciate that. Henry, of course, to you and your team here. Your colleagues, thank you for putting this on. I appreciate it very much. Thank you for thinking about this event. I should also thank, of course, the folks who made this book possible at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. They saw this project through in a rather timely fashion, as I understand it. These things can take a long time in the academic world, and this was a sprint, I'm told. So I appreciate that as well. And of course, to Harvard University Press for their role too in disseminating the book. Very much appreciated. Before I say anything substantive at this point, I should point out that I'm here in my quasi-academic capacity. Is that okay to say?
Yes.
And not in my official capacity. I have to say that for obvious reasons. I think those of you who work for the U.S. government know why. But also, I'd like to have a really sort of frank exchange of ideas and speaking from my academic perspective will allow me to do that at least more so than from the other perspective. Although, of course, I'm still one person. So, but I will navigate that as we move forward. Let me just say a few words about how this project came about and came together, frankly, in case that's of interest to anyone. The Moscow factor is something that's been sort of percolating in the back of my mind in terms of it's really been present since I started working at the U.S. Department of State back in '91, sort of observing from sort of very low vantage point, certainly then, how U.S. policy towards the region, the broader region, not just toward Ukraine, was put together and then implemented, and noticing a certain phenomenon which I call the Moscow factor for these purposes, but I realize it's not a perfect moniker, and it's really kind of a catch-all that applies to Russia-related considerations in the context of policy toward other countries in the region. But I was able to observe how this factor has played out and how it has frankly influenced, if not our policy formulation, certainly the way that our policy played out in the real world out there. So the effect has been cumulative, and it sort of led me to this path. It put me on this path toward this project based on those observations over the years, really over the decade at this point. But really, if I had to sort of point, if you pressed me against the wall and said, what's the sort of one thing that really led you to write this book? I think it was the lethal assistance issue. That was the log that broke the camel's back, if you will, as opposed to the straw. Just in the way that it played out in the context of naked Russian aggression against Ukraine, also in the context of Ukraine's denuclearization and our commitment to Ukraine's independence. And sort of, if you put all those factors together and compare what was at stake, what was happening, and what we were doing, which was arguably precious little, it really sort of convinced me that this project is not just something that's nice to do, but a must in many ways. Now, of course, this book, for those of you who don't know, is based on my dissertation. So I should also mention George Mason University. I think it was referenced in the introduction. So thank you. But just to underscore that it came out of the dissertation process at George Mason University, and I had a terrific committee there. I won't mention them by name, but they're certainly listed in the book. So I had to jump through the academic hoops on the way. Is that okay to say?
Of course, yeah. A lot of hoops. Yeah, a lot of hoops.
In terms of justifying it and checking certain boxes, important boxes, to be sure along the way. But actually, at first I resisted the process, and then I sort of embraced it, because that's what one ought to do if there's no choice, really, if one wants to get across the finish line. And so as part of that process, I identified certain gaps that were, of course, from my perspective at least, that existed in the literature. And luckily for this project, there were some gaps that were pertinent that I attempted to address. There were, of course, terrific books out there already, which touched on this issue to one extent or another. Steve Piper's book on bilateral relations between the United States and Ukraine was one, so part of sort of the body of literature now on U.S. diplomatic history vis-a-vis the post-Soviet region. Paul Danieri's book came out later in terms of Ukrainian-Russian, Russian-Ukrainian relations. There are quite a few others, and sort of when you mention a few, there's also pressure to mention others, but I'll stop right there. But no books that addressed the impact of what I refer to as the Moscow factor on U.S. bilateral policy towards Ukraine. These other books that I mentioned, Steve's and Paul's, had to do with bilateral relations, more or less, but not, if you will, the impact of third-party considerations on bilateral relations, of U.S. bilateral relations toward another country. And so I wanted to very much address that issue. I also wanted to take on, however indirectly, the question of the contestation narrative, there might be other views here, and by the way, of course, I welcome that. But the contestation narrative that's out there and has been written about in a number of books basically says that the U.S. and Russia are competing over Ukraine, and not just competing, or the broader region as well, but including Ukraine, not just competing, but competing in ways that are similar and are equally more or less destructive to Ukraine. I won't take on that narrative because, having had the experience that I've had, including on the policy side, I wish the United States was competing as much as the contestation narrative suggests. Simply hasn't been the case in my experience. I'd love to hear other views, of course, as well. But also another reason why I want to take on this contestation narrative is because it almost invariably treats Ukraine as just a place. It's a place on a map. Ukraine and Ukrainians have no agency or voice, and things happen to them. There are these large powers that compete over the territory, but Ukrainians have no say in that competition, or are not actors and important actors in the drama that has been unfolding since the collapse of the USSR. My key research questions, and for those of you who keep track of such things, I really had to do with sort of asking, is the Moscow factor present? And again, there's a definition in the book. That's a yes or no, essentially. It's dichotomous in that regard. But also, how has it manifested itself if it's present? What impact has it had? And under what key circumstances has it played out? So those were it's kind of a range of research questions that I tried and hopefully succeeded to a certain degree in answering. A few, so the last one that I mentioned deserves perhaps some additional information, and that is, under what circumstances has the Moscow factor played out? And I essentially laid out 8 independent variables having to do with the extent of US policy focus on domestic issues as one variable, the importance of other foreign policy issues that the US government was dealing with at the time, the degree of commitment. And I would be happy to answer any questions related to this, because some of these are subjective, of course. Many are subjective. But the degree of an administration's commitment to the policy of Europe whole, free, and at peace. And then there were a few others, some key ones, sort of the degree to which Kiev's behavior was consistent with US policy objectives, the degree to which Moscow's behavior was consistent with US policy objectives, the role of Congress, the role of the diaspora, and finally the role of policy champions. There's abundant literature on that aspect, but I wanted to capture that as well. So those were the independent variables against which I ran the data, and I'd be happy to expand on any of that, of course. One thing I wanted to do as part of this project is to leverage really many, frankly, sources of data, but in a sort of a new, hopefully, way to bring those data points to bear. And that includes newly declassified information. As you know, as you're probably aware of, in terms of the US government declassification process, it churns on and on with the passage of time. There's some challenges. I see some reactions in the audience, so you're aware of some of the challenges pertaining to that. But overall, as time passes, more and more information becomes available, and I reviewed any and all bits of information pertaining to this issue set to try to include it in the book, so that could be of interest as well, to supplement open, sort of, traditional open source information that was available already. I won't bore you with the table of contents. You can look at it. I think it's actually available online at this point as well. But I essentially, sort of the meat of the book pertains to the 4 case studies that I identified. They happen to represent 2 Democratic and 2 Republican administrations. That wasn't part of the design necessarily, but I'm happy that ended up being the case. It's important for some scholars, and I was happy to check that box as well. So the 4 case studies pertained to particular US government policy decision points that had to do with, in the first case, the question of recognizing Ukraine as an independent state at the time of the USSR's ongoing collapse. The second one had to do with denuclearization, Ukraine's denuclearization. The third with the so-called Orange Revolution, popular protests against the stolen election as engineered by then President Kuchma and the individual who would have benefited from that stolen election, Viktor Yanukovych, who comes back to haunt Ukraine later, of course. And the fourth one I already alluded to, and that is the question of lethal assistance in the context of Russia's aggression against Ukraine starting in 2014. And of course, at the end, I do a sort of cross-case analysis to compare the cases and sort of bring to bear what came out of that study. I won't cover all the cases. Please don't worry. I'll just point out, and this is known already, but there's more information that came to light, and that is that in the context of the John, there's a chair here up front if you would. In the context of the first case study, there was a high degree of U.S. government commitment, starting with the then president, Bush 41 at that point, focusing on preserving the Soviet Union, almost at the expense of other considerations. It's not what there was a certain logic present at the time, and that is President Bush wanted to saw someone with whom he could work, someone in the Kremlin with whom he could work. There were indications that Gorbachev would roll back the Soviet presence in the world, focus more on internal problems, and President Bush wanted to pocket the benefits of those dynamics, but there was at the same time, there was a lack of understanding and frankly, a lack of imagination in terms of the processes that were already underway in the USSR, then including, and especially those pertaining to the former Union republics and people's desire to move past the Soviet years, the Soviet nightmare, at least in the view of some, and to live in their own independent countries and make decisions about their future without having to go through Moscow. By the way, this is important, and it pertains today in a sense that Putin, as part of Putin's false narratives, he continues to claim that the United States worked to dismember the Soviet Union, and the historical evidence underscores that that's clearly not the case. In terms of the second case, in terms of the denuclearization, it became very clear, and again, there's ample, this is all amply documented at this point in the book, that Ukraine's interests were dismissed as part of the denuclearization pressure that Ukraine was feeling both from Moscow and from Washington. Ukraine's interests were not just dismissed, they were subsumed. And this was all done to support Boris Yeltsin as president of Russia, to make sure that he could hold on to power in Moscow, and Ukraine's sort of attempted discussions of its interests, which were not necessarily consistent with denuclearization, just were not heard or appreciated. Hence the presence of the Moscow factor. In terms of the Orange Revolution, that was a challenging one in the sense that we became major cheerleaders of when it became clear that the people of Ukraine would triumph against the attempted, the falsified election. But even as we were cheering Ukraine on and the people of Ukraine on, we were very careful. And this is just, it's part of the record. I'm not necessarily evaluating it or judging it, but we're very careful not to mention Russia as a particularly negative player in the context of the attempted stolen election. Russia played a key role in that effort in urging Kuchma and Yanukovych on, and we chose to. This was not just kind of this is not by omission, but it was by commission, frankly. We chose not to focus on Moscow's negative role then, and arguably, in case you're connecting the dots here in the way that I am, at least, arguably Moscow perhaps learned the wrong lesson as part of that experience, looking forward then to 2014 and what Moscow decided to do vis-a-vis Ukraine then. Speaking of 2014 in the last case, and I'll wrap up after that, it was clear that while the Obama administration largely said the right things, there was not much follow through. And as time went on, the administration, frankly, I'm not picking on the Obama administration, it's true. You'll see that I'm an equal opportunity critic in this book. The Obama administration actually moved the goalposts in terms of what the US government would do in response to further Russian aggression at the time in the 2014-2015 window. There were other priorities, and those priorities became more and more prominent in the administration's thinking. Again, not judging, just a matter of historical record. It had to do with Iran, had to do with Syria. And I suspect, and these things are not yet available, but I suspect what the record will show in the future that there may have been a view that something concrete could be achieved in Syria and on the Iranian nuclear front. And in terms of Ukraine, Russia has many advantages, including something called escalation dominance, and therefore it's not worth the effort to go beyond the rhetorical, so largely rhetorical. There was material support as well, but largely rhetorical support for Ukraine. This escalation dominance has, I would say, largely been debunked in terms of the ongoing war since Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine, but that's maybe for the discussion. Let me, other observations very quickly, just maybe provoke some thinking. I will skip the projected utility. That's probably too academic, right, for these purposes. And certainly we can talk about current relevance. But in terms of the other takeaways, there was remarkable consistency over time in terms of how the Moscow factor played out across these four case studies, four key decision points, and across administrations. Some more liberal, some more conservative, some more internationalist, if you will, some more focused on the domestic agenda, and everything in between. These were actually four interesting administrations to look at. Ukraine was rarely the focus or the priority for the United States. It was out there, it was considered, it was discussed, it came up in various ways, but it was largely instrumental in the context of sort of bigger, at least perceived bigger priorities for the United States government. Beyond, and you can probably see why I had to emphasize that I'm speaking from my academic perspective, beyond the typical verbiage about supporting Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and sovereignty, which that's very important, obviously. There was no real strategy, no discernible strategy that was consistent, that could play out over time, and that had a vision for Ukraine and its role in the new Eastern Europe. So that's something to consider as well. The so-called realist approaches to international relations very often skewed perceptions of what I would argue of U.S. interests in the region, again, from my perspective. The cultural encounter was something referred to as Russia. And I realize Russia exists as a country, but I'm talking about the cultural experience with Russia. Things Russians tended to dominate our collective views of the region. This familiarity with Russia actually played out in very concrete ways, including in terms of history, not just history of the region, but understanding of such things as, for example, Crimea. People say, well, Crimea was always Russian. And so, you know, it's much more complicated. Those of you who know, it's much more complicated than that, but that's the familiarity with Russia that sort of weighed heavily in terms of perceptions and could, and probably did influence policy conversations as well. And this leads me to my last point, sort of uneven historical understanding of the region, an underappreciation of what a successful Ukraine, I stress successful because there's the other option, a successful Ukraine could mean for our interests in Europe, including security interests, and some of this again is playing out in the east and south of Ukraine as we speak. I'd be happy to sort of follow up on any of these aspects or entertain any other questions. I'll stop right there.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll take the prerogative of the chair just to ask a couple questions, maybe sort of big questions, maybe kind of unfair questions if they take you beyond the scope of the book. But I guess just you kind of, there's sort of two related questions. One is sort of how important do you think all this was? Like how influential was the U.S. really, or could it have been really in these policies, right? Because there could be an argument that a lot of what we see happening might have happened regardless of U.S. intervention. As devil's advocate, I'll put that out there. And then the other question would be, what do you think would have been the consequences had the United States more consistently and robustly, kind of recognized Ukraine as an agent and recognized its agency more, strongly, at these different critical junctures. Because I think my guess is that people who are on the other side of some of these arguments, their argument might be that, well, maybe we would have just seen what we're seeing today a lot sooner. And maybe that's good, maybe that's bad. But on the other hand, I think a lot of people think that you could have seen a much more positive situation, right? Either a weaker Russia, a more contained Russia, and a stronger Ukraine better able to reflect its interests. So I just like to ask you maybe to comment on those kind of big picture questions about how all this relates to your findings in the book.
Henry, you're right, those are unfair.
Yeah.
Just know that they're great questions, of course. How influential? I think our posture on all four decision points that I describe in the book was quite relevant and I would say influential. And I'll just make the following arguments to see if that satisfies you or not. Certainly, given the relationship that the White House had with the Kremlin at the time of the USSR's collapse, other countries, other governments were watching what we would do in terms of recognizing Ukraine and the other countries coming out of the rubble of the USSR. When we delayed, when we postponed the decision, others postponed as well. So it's Canada, to give Canada credit. Canada just forged ahead. I think Canada was the first to recognize Ukraine's independence. But otherwise, people were waiting because of the perception, at least, of US leadership in the world, including in the context of Europe and including on relations with Moscow. They were waiting to see how it would play out in terms of our own decisions before making that decision for their governments as well. It's one aspect that I simply didn't have time or space to get into is perceptions in allied capitals. So directly related to your question, but certainly in the context of the earlier issue of German reunification and related questions, I think our allied Western capitals were loath to cross us by and large. Canada, again, was a clear exception because of the perceived nature of the US-Soviet relationship and how much was riding on what various governments were hoping would be a kind of a smooth landing in terms of Gorbachev's efforts to remain in power. And they, to be fair to them as well, they were also concerned about Gorbachev's standing. So they had their own reasons to be careful as well. On the nuclear question, we were very much involved in driving the denuclearization agenda. We had our own reasons for it. So your question is a very good one, and it wasn't always, we didn't always do things because of Moscow. And the denuclearization question is particularly relevant in that regard. But again, in the book, there's evidence that I bring to bear, in which the U.S. government connected denuclearization with Yeltsin's standing in Moscow and the need to support him, and therefore the desire to make sure that Ukraine and the other potentially nuclear countries, Belarus and Kazakhstan, would not hold on to their Soviet-era nuclear arsenals. On the Orange Revolution, I just have to sort of use one phrase there. I think the freedom agenda. It became a key component of George W. Bush's policy in his second term, but this was already playing out towards the end of his first term, and the Orange Revolution was quite fortuitous for his purposes because he was able to point to that as something that we were supposedly successful in, and to make that try to make that the theme of his second term. And on the lethal assistance question, again, not to belabor the point too much, but it was clear that there were governments, particularly in Europe, who wanted to do more for Ukraine and provide lethal assistance to that country beginning in 2014, but they were either waiting for cover from us or frankly for us to set the example to create the policy space for them to do the same. So we played a very important role in that as well. But it's a very good question, and my answers are not to suggest that somehow history in the capital H would necessarily be all that different. But the fact remains, so those would be the alternatives. Always difficult to talk about hypotheticals, but certainly it was the Moscow factor was present in an effective policy. On the second, speaking of hypotheticals, this is even more so in terms of had we sort of recognized and afforded Ukraine more agency in voice, if I understood correctly, in our policy early on. First of all, I should point out that much also depends and has depended on the Ukrainians in that regard. And if we can't talk about Ukraine and Ukraine's voice and agency without also acknowledging that they do have voice and agency, and that voice, unfortunately for Ukraine, has not always been one that has made it easy to help Ukraine move forward to get past its Soviet era legacy. And here I'm not talking about the people of Ukraine who are, as we see, the hope of the country. I'm talking about the post-Soviet elites. In fact, I differentiate between post-Soviet elites and Ukrainian civil society. I do that for a reason. So the post-Soviet elites have not always made it easy to support Ukraine and to help Ukraine reach its full post-Soviet potential. But I would like to think that if we were more focused on Ukraine, devoted more resources, and were able to get the Ukrainian elites to consider the country's interests more than their own at key moments, I suspect the region would look a little different, not in a geographic sense, but in terms of a number of other priority parameters, including perhaps Ukraine's earlier integration into European and perhaps even Euro-Atlantic institutions. That hasn't happened, and some of this is playing out today.
All right, well, terrific. So let's go ahead and open things up. See, I have a lot of questions here. So let's see, I see Sufyan first. I'll try to keep a list of other questions. So just first of all, no, we are being recorded, and we ask that you identify yourself unless you prefer not to be identified. But Sufyan, go ahead.
Sufyan from George Washington University. I have a question, two-part question about the denuclearization historical. So, as you mentioned, 3 countries had nuclear weapons besides Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Belarus and Kazakhstan didn't make a big deal of it. But for some reason, Ukraine didn't want to get rid of it. There was a special Budapest memorandum. The question is why they were able and how they were able, Ukraine was able to get this special treatment, special status. And more importantly, no matter why that history happened, does that memorandum, can that memorandum play any role in today's conflict? Because President Zelensky brought that issue a number of times, kind of giving some kind of legitimacy for protection against the Russian nuclear threat.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for those questions. I mean, Ukraine was in a slightly different place in terms of that dynamic than Belarus and Kazakhstan in a number of ways. Ukraine had a very strong and robust history of anti-Soviet activity. And as you know, in terms of what transpired at the time of the Soviet collapse, it was the sort of the second tier of the Communist Party of Ukraine, led by Leonid Kravchuk, who co-opted the nationalist agenda, the national democratic agenda, to be more accurate, on behalf of demanding Ukraine's independence. So there was a history of struggle that was much stronger, much more explicit, and much more large scale in Ukraine than in Belarus, the anti-Soviet struggle in Ukraine than in Belarus. In Kazakhstan, so Ukraine started already being in a different place than the other 2 countries. But let me mention two other aspects. Ukrainians were quite present in the Soviet nuclear effort. Korolev, the sometimes mislabeled father of the Soviet atomic bomb, because they stole, obviously, the designs. But Korolev was a Ukrainian. He worked at an institute in Ukraine. Quite a few other institutes were involved in the Soviet nuclear effort, and something like 30% of the Soviet Strategic Rocket Forces Officer Corps were Ukrainians, let's say people from Ukraine. So Ukraine, perhaps more than the others, had at least the notional possibility of making things work if Kiev had decided to hold on to the Soviet era nuclear weapons. But there's another reason I think that's just much more proximal and explains the situation better. The Russian leader who questioned Ukraine's borders was first in the post-Soviet context was not Vladimir Putin, it was Boris Yeltsin. And he did so at the end of August of 1991 when he referenced what are those areas called? Crimea and the Donbass as things that perhaps Ukraine should not hold on to if it truly wants to be independent. So again, late August 1991, and that influenced Ukrainian perceptions tremendously beyond the other factors that I mentioned, which also played a role. And then finally on this point, Belarus and Kazakhstan, to the extent that they were thinking of making hay of this issue, didn't have to do much work because Ukraine was doing their work for them in this regard. And they indeed benefited from the outcome of Ukraine's efforts to get at least something in return for denuclearization. On the question of the Budapest memorandum that you referenced, I mean, today the phrase, those of you who are Ukrainians in the room, you please correct me if I'm wrong, but Budapest memorandum is almost like an insult, sort of an uncouth term in a sense that, of course, it in many ways, practical ways, it was not worth the paper that it was written on. It became sort of like the terms reform and democracy in certain circles when things were done under the guise of reform and democracy, but just allowed people to carry on with business as usual in the post-Soviet countries. What else can I say? Applicability today. Look, Steve Pfeiffer is a terrific source on this question, so I would again recommend for those of you who don't know his book, look at his book. It's called The Eagle and the Trident, I believe. And he was one of the he was in many ways the policy point person for these negotiations. And as I point out, the security assurances that Ukraine got, they were not security guarantees. They were not nothing either. They assured Ukraine's security that ought to mean something. But again, this gets back to the point I made earlier, and that is simply that we lacked imagination. We didn't want to listen to the Ukrainians who said we have some real issues with the Russians, no matter who is in charge in the Kremlin, and bad things will happen. And guess what? They have. So that means that forever follow-on document that may emerge, it will have the challenge of overcoming this very accurate perception that the Budapest Memorandum made things worse, not better.
Okay, thank you. So should we use the microphone? Is that, yeah, so the gentleman in the light blue shirt.
Yes, thank you. Roman Kalichak, Ivan Franko University from Lviv, Ukraine, business school. Thank you, first of all, for the contribution. It's long overdue. It's quite important book. But my question for you as a scholar, because you work with a lot of documents, yes, and how relevant, how influential was academic expertise or the lack of academic expertise on Ukraine in shaping US policy toward the country and giving the primacy of the Moscow? Thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here. Thank you so much. And thank you for your kind words. I think he's trying to get me in trouble. How influential.
We can take it. Yeah, we can take it.
Yeah. I mean, the academic works are out there. They're available to everyone. No, I mean, to be fair, look, I think the works themselves are important, but it comes down to very often in terms of who has access, who's considered to be an expert on a particular issue set, whose opinion is not only considered but sought on these issues. And over time, and if you take the time to look at the book, you will see that I went out of my way, perhaps too much so, to try to, before introducing the Bush 41 case study, I went out of my way to spend time on the leading academic narrative at the time in terms of the Soviet Union, the state of US-Soviet relations, what the future may hold, really smart people. And no one considered what was about to transpire in the cases of some works within a year. I don't want to be unfair. these things are always challenging, but most of the leading academics of the day in the works that I cite there, and I believe they're representative, talked about the long-term sort of ramifications for U.S.-Soviet relations, what that might look like, and did not even just to dismiss it, but did not mention the possibility that the Soviet Union might not exist. Again, I don't want to be unfair, although I will point out, since I have the mic, I will point out there's a master's student at a Boston area university. I wrote my master's thesis well before the collapse on the prospects for the formation of Ukrainian armed forces. In my committee, three members did not think it's all that relevant, but thankfully the chair did. Yeah. But anyway, so impact, I think the impact was largely negative, frankly, in terms of, because it rather than explore the possibilities, it reinforced some of the perceptions and misperceptions, the conventional wisdom of the time, in terms of what the challenges will be around the corner. This is not to say that there weren't academics and other thinkers, not necessarily in academic positions, who were not much more attuned to the nationalities question, as it was called then. Paul Goebel, who I believe still writes quite a bit, was one of those people, and he deserves credit. I should also point out that I happened to start at the Department of State in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research in a unit that was called the Nationalities Section, which was tucked away in the what was then called the Soviet Internal Division. It was tucked away, but it existed, and it's where we considered. We tried to focus, those of us who worked in that small unit, tried to focus on the other Union republics, if you will, if I may call them that, other nationalities in the Soviet Union, to look beyond the Kremlin. But those voices, and then setting that what I just said aside, talking about academics and the think tank community, those voices were few and far between, and it does not look like, based on the record that I was able to review, had much impact.
Great, yes.
Thank you. I'm Katerina Shenkaruk. I'm also Ukrainian. I come from Kiev, Ukraine, and here with the Bush School for Government Public Service in Washington, D.C. And between 2013 and 2020, I worked at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev political section.
We're colleagues.
So I very much appreciated your analysis on lack of vision for Ukraine in Eastern Europe, lack of strategy for Ukraine, and viewing Ukraine through Russian cultural lenses. And basically, my question is related to that. How much do you see this in addition to non-functional security architecture in Europe, which we could all see? Actually, how much of a readiness or even signs of shifting these perspectives you see now with the current administration, and maybe in your academic hat you will make some recommendations.
Thank you. Could you, before you hand the mic back, expand on the security architecture challenge?
Well, what I meant by non-functional security architecture was, like, again, lack of vision for Eastern Europe in the security architecture and any security guarantees for non-NATO members in Europe. Basically, Soviet states, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that were part of Europe, as part of Eastern Europe, but not part of Russia, were not provided any security guarantees from Russia. And as you rightly noted, Russia was the major territorial threat. And even throughout 1990s already, according to the public opinion polls, Ukrainian elites of all colors had seen Russia as a major security threat. So this is somehow was dismissed because Ukraine was looked at through Soviet/Russian lenses.
Yes, thank you so much. I appreciate the question. A number of ways to approach this. I'll say the following. There's a security deficit in the east of the European continent. That security deficit has been there all along because of that area, the gray zone. And gray zone can refer to many different things, including what's between our ears. but the gray zone between institutional Europe, transatlantic, the transatlantic community, if you will, and Russia, and arguably much more aggressive Russia. This issue has not been adequately addressed. It was dismissed. I would argue, personally speaking, that it contributed to what we have today in terms of Russia's ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. There were early efforts, including under Kuchma, who overall was not a positive. I'm being magnanimous. He was not a positive for Ukraine, but even he tried to introduce the concept of I think it was called the zone of security and stability in Central and Eastern Europe, recognizing that there is that gray zone, and that at some point the window on the ability to reshape the security architecture that you referenced would close, or would be closing. That was never taken seriously for a variety of reasons. Kuchma and other leaders of Ukraine, and they're all to blame to one extent or another, made it easy to say no, in part through their own behavior, unwillingness to pursue reform, answer the demands of the Ukrainian people, et cetera, et cetera. You know this much better than I do, certainly. And so this resulted in what we have to, not to shift the blame is squarely at its core, of course, on Vladimir Putin and his imperial ambitions. But still, we could have done something more. And this actually harkens back to Henry's question, I think, in terms of, sort of the alternative history. And, if Ukraine were more prioritized, maybe if we took Ukraine's security issues, security challenges more seriously, and under the right circumstances in terms of Ukraine reforming, Ukraine being more in line with our general Western values at the time, maybe this would have been addressed much more directly and sooner. Which brings us to the other part of your question, that is now in my recommendations, which I will attempt to give some very broad ones. But I think the very first one, frankly, is one of opening up our minds a bit more, understanding that Ukraine is fighting for all of us, not just for Ukraine. Ukraine is protecting Europe. If the first point is true, then the second point follows. Ukraine is protecting Europe against an aggressive Russia. Should Putin have his way with Ukraine, and I don't think that would be the case, largely because of the bravery of the people of Ukraine, and as well as our assistance, of course, as well. But if he were to have his way with Ukraine, that aggression would not end there. I think countries and governments and societies, frankly, in the east of the continent understand that more than others. This is where sort of the established part of NATO, if you will, the old Europe was the reference, needs to be less dismissive of those concerns, because what more evidence does one need than what's happening in Ukraine today in terms of Russia's aggression? Take that more seriously and understand that until these issues, until the security deficit in the east of the continent is addressed, this kind of aggression with pauses will continue, with greater and greater costs, frankly, both in human lives and treasure. And then at the end of that, if you accept all of that, and this, you asked me for recommendations, so I'm offering some things. I would say at the end of that, there needs to be a recognition that, this might sound really strange to some, and I apologize, that NATO needs Ukraine at least as much as Ukraine needs NATO in a number of ways. And yes, we can provide additional military assistance. We can make Ukraine stronger in the military sphere. But at some point, there's the question of where does Ukraine belong? And I think the people of Ukraine have made very clear where they think it should belong.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Gavin Wild, Carnegie Endowment. I had a question kind of expanding on the previous one. Insofar as Ukraine has been relegated to kind of a subject of tug and pull between Washington and Moscow during this period you cover, I wonder if you could speak on 2008 Bucharest Summit Declaration and what role that played, and whether decisions like that, or decisions such as Berlin made, in the early aughts with regard to energy supply, the degree to which those kinds of decisions kind of relegated Kyiv into that role. And if you cover that in your book, I'm looking forward to reading it.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate the questions. Nord Stream, not so much. I think there's a reference to Nord Stream and the broader issue set. The Bucharest NATO summit is referenced in the context of what had transpired at the end of the Bush 43 administration and so the lead up to the Obama administration in terms of Georgia, certainly. So they're referenced, but I suspect not fully to your liking because they weren't the real focus of these four case studies. But I think they were quite important. There are many things Russia does not do well. There are many mistakes the Kremlin leadership makes, and actually Putin has now a long and impressive list of mistakes and miscalculations he's made vis-a-vis Ukraine. It's certainly impressive in that regard. But what they do relatively well is read the body language of the West in terms of where it stands, including on these important issues. The Bush 43 administration at the time, and I was then at the vice president's office, attempted to make the most of a difficult situation in terms of, and I think this is what you're alluding to, in terms of the issue of the membership action plan for Ukraine, in time for the Bucharest NATO summit. My personal feeling at the time was that the effort was too late to organize. It was undertaken too late in the process. As those of you know, and I'm looking at one individual in particular, these NATO summits, they take a long time to organize. Lots of stuff goes into that, many governments, et cetera, et cetera. But there was an effort to encourage the alliance to think in terms in response to, and I want to emphasize this, in response to the requests, the interest in Tbilisi and Kyiv to one extent or another. I say that because there's this false narrative out there that we are pulling people into the alliance, kicking and screaming. The fact of the matter is that, and it's something I discussed with a colleague earlier today, there was significant demand. There's a certain history with Russia, one could say, and they saw an opportunity. There were other reasons as well, but this was front and center in many ways. So at the end, what transpired was inspiring in some sense, in terms of saying that Georgia and Ukraine would be members of the alliance, and that's an important reference point. Still, you make with it as much as you can, because that's a promise of sorts, and it's still on the books, and it should be, in my personal view. But what really happened is with that kind of language without the membership action plan progress, and therefore with very little to show for the rhetoric, it became in some ways the worst of both worlds, and I suspect it fed into the Kremlin's calculation, including in terms of the Georgia war. On Nord Stream, much has been said. A lot of this has played out already in terms of how the predictions of Moscow. This is not purely commercial. This is not just about gas. This is whatever others want to say, want to think and say. However, the German government wanted to explain it away for Moscow was much more than commercial. It was leverage. And I think we've seen evidence that proves that very much. It was very dangerous. As I've tried to explain to our German friends, and I'm certainly not alone, and certainly a much lesser voice than many others, but essentially deepening Germany's dependence on Russian gas increased the chances of what has transpired, and that is Russia's large-scale invasion of Ukraine. It's a pretty direct relationship. This is not through some twists and turns. It's pretty direct. So yet again, this probably gave Putin additional confidence to proceed with his plans in the context of this reality, and that is that he essentially was able to engineer. I say this somewhat jokingly, and please don't take it too far, but this sort of Molotov-Ribbentrop gas agreement at the expense of others, especially in Central and Eastern Europe.
Okay, thank you.
I think the whole nuclear question is probably the most fascinating thing. But I totally understand America's point of view and really the world, that they just wanted to get these nuclear powers removed. I wrote, I'm a journalist. I spent back to the collapse in both in Russia and Ukraine for 15 years. I actually wrote something in '93 that we should just buy them, whatever the cost, But let me ask you about something else. The whole non-lethal aid, I think, was a really bad decision and very questionably moral, and really just became worse and worse as time went on. And I watched, after Maidan, the whole, I mean, Crimea was, painless, and if one Russian had died, I think Donbass maybe wouldn't have happened. But Ukraine couldn't get its act together, and I had 3 friends and 10 acquaintances killed in 2014 and 15. It was just agonizing, because you could see this all coming for 3 or 4 months, because the revolutionary government had no legitimacy and couldn't really do anything. Could you talk about that and the push and pull and the Biden administration? Because I wrote
The push and
pull in the lethal aid, and was it just laziness? I mean, was it just easier to not deal with the whole thing by just saying, oh, it'll cause more death and destruction, and Ukraine is so weak they can't really resist Russia?
Thank you for that question. I can just say you answered it to a certain extent. No, I'm joking, of course. I appreciate the question. Just on the nuclear aspect, I know that wasn't your question, but you opened the door to it. So let me say the following: the nuclear situation that came about at the end of the Soviet collapse was unprecedented, because if you actually look at the NPT language, the non-proliferation, nuclear non-proliferation treaty language, Ukraine and frankly Belarus and Kazakhstan didn't really fit the description, because they were parts of a country, an empire in many ways, but legally speaking, of a country that's fragmented. They didn't acquire it. It was just there, and it was theirs. It was on their territory as part of the legal transitioning from the Soviet Union to independence. So there was that challenge as well, and people had to jump through some semantic hoops to try to say that an NPT applies. But at the end of the day, Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan agreed. So I'm not questioning that per se, but it was unprecedented, and I'm not sure to what extent it was really a threat in terms of proliferation, because of the way that this came about. It wasn't a transfer of technology. It wasn't a transfer of weapons. These countries just had them. Right. You can define it whatever, how you want to call it, but perhaps more seriously and more, and this is more relevant today, the fact that Putin attacked and is pursuing territorial aggrandizement in a neighboring country in Europe, by the way, so it's not just UN but OSCE space, and it's a country that gave up nuclear weapons. It has its effect on the non-proliferation regime, because I'm speculating here, but what do you think that has, what kind of effect it has on those who have thought about nuclear programs, those who have nuclear programs? They're probably not impressed by the kinds of security assurances, since this came up earlier in the Budapest Memorandum. So it's not great for non-proliferation as well, which is one of our, of course, government priorities. On the question of non-lethal assistance, you used the word decision. I'll just point out that it was actually a non-decision. If you look at the sort of the record, same idea. In effect, it was a decision not to decide. Let's say, but that by itself is interesting. I think so. There was no decision not to, as far as the available record shows. I should point out there was no decision not to provide or to provide for that matter. Why did it occur? I alluded to this in my introductory remarks. I think there was this perception of Russian escalation dominance. Looking at the way the Russian military has performed so far, it's almost laughable, but let's take it for what it was then. There was the issue, I'll just quote President Obama. He referred to Ukraine as a Russian client state. I think he did so actually in one of the, was it in the State of the Union or some major speech, which I would say was a gross misrepresentation of the reality. I don't know who wrote it. This is not about personalities, but there was a lack of understanding. And if you say client state, and if you say Crimea, it's different, and then it's a slippery slope that at some point leads you to the conclusion that, there's not much we can do, and B, is this really that unnatural? And the answer is, since we've been doing a lot since the large-scale invasion, yes, there is a lot we can do, and B, it's not natural. This is internationally recognized Ukrainian territory, including by Russia in the context of the large treaty of 1997. And so it's a mistake, and it's a slippery slope, especially again in the OCE space, because then that begs the question of standards of international behavior in addition to non-proliferation considerations. So I think I would just leave it. I would leave it at that. Other than also to point out that the way you said it, and again, just for the sake of a back and forth, if you would like, it's not that the revolutionary government had no legitimacy. I mean, the parliament remained the same parliament, for example, and it was enacting laws. It's that the Yanukovych administration worked throughout its time in office.
I mean, they were unelected.
Right. No. Let's be more specific. Who was unelected? Turchinov as the acting president. He was speaker of the parliament. So there was some legitimacy there, not the same as someone who was elected as president by the people. I understand that, but I would also point out that issue was very quickly addressed at the end of May of that year when Petro Poroshenko was elected president. But the point is that the Yanukovych government went out of its way to destroy Ukrainian statehood from within. And that destruction of the Ukrainian statehood pertained to the destruction, the hollowing out of the Ukrainian armed forces and the security forces, which made it virtually impossible to withstand the initial Russian aggression in 2014. So it wasn't just the Russian aggression. It wasn't that Ukrainians just couldn't do anything about Crimea. There was also the issue of what was done to the tools that the state would normally use to withstand external aggression.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, Bill Veritoni. Thank you for this. So going back to the security assurances for getting up the nukes, in 2014, I don't want to say that the U.S. and West's response was feckless, but feckless adjacent. But given that history, I was going to ask about the effect on non-proliferation, but we just talked about it. But the second part was, if you think about an end to the current crisis, there most likely has to be some kind of Western security guarantee for Ukraine. But security assurances have basically failed in the past. And how do you think that will affect the course of this in terms of I'm sure you're going to talk about how Ukrainians have viewed that and how they currently view it.
Thank you. That's obviously a very difficult question to answer. One could only speculate at this point, including on the aspect of end to the war. because he could be with us for some time. In terms of, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because though, frankly, in my personal view, again, just to underscore, those who call for quick negotiations are missing the point. That would only benefit Russia. And that's not a good way to go, because then the negotiations would be about how much of Ukrainian territorial integrity to compromise. And that's not a good thing in the center of Europe, in the center of the OSCE space. So one has to be very careful with that. I think over time, I don't want to do too much, I don't want to predict too many things here. That's often a thankless task. But over time, the answer will emerge. And it will emerge based on the ability the Ukrainian ability to demilitarize Russia. I say that somewhat facetiously because it's been Russia's goal, one of the objectives, to demilitarize Ukraine. But given the tremendous Russian losses in Ukraine, it's not without some merit to say that. But it'll depend on what transpires on the battlefield, the extent to which the Ukrainians succeed in liberating more and more of their currently Russian-occupied territory, and what that does in terms of convincing European governments and frankly Washington, Ottawa, and others that Ukraine is capable of, not only capable of surviving as a state, but retaking territory, and is actually should be a sought-after partner in security and however that emerges in the aftermath of the conclusion of the war. There are many twists. I mentioned twists and turns before. I'm sure there are many twists and turns coming. This is not all that simple, and Putin does not seem to recognize that there's a rear gear somewhere. And if he does recognize that, it's that he doesn't like to use it. He's much more prone to doubling down. So I think we'll see more of that before anything else happens in the other direction. But I think how this war concludes, and ideally with Ukrainian victory, because Ukraine's defeat is not really a choice; it's not an option. I think then it will more naturally lend itself to a more sustainable outcome, which will take into account Ukraine's contribution to European and Euro-Atlantic security.
Thank you. Sorry, Ellen, in the front here.
No, thank you, Ellen Nakashima with Washington Post. Thank you for fascinating remarks. I can't wait to read your book. I'm a journalist, so I was like sort of the personal aspects of the story, which I hope you have in your book, but if not, I'm going to ask you a question. One's backward looking and then one based on today. And hopefully it doesn't make you too uncomfortable, but I can't help but imagine in the 30 years you've been there and with your wealth of knowledge and experience, you must have had thoughts, feelings, and input hopefully into policies. There were times in which you were in the policy seat and times when you were more in the intelligence analyst seat when you don't need policy, but you contribute to hopefully so that the decision makers informed policies and options. At these critical junctures, especially with 2008, 2014, did you try to speak up? Did you say, look, I don't believe in Russian escalation dominance. It doesn't exist. Did you say, like, we need to have more, we have a lack of vision or imagination? I don't know, you probably didn't use those words, but you know what I'm saying. Did you try? What was that like? How did you feel? Must have been a bit frustrating to the extent you can.
How I felt.
Yeah, really. Like, when you said this, something about what was it, adjacent? Feckless adjacent. I mean, you said that. He said that. But
Bill deserves credit for that. I just noted the fact that he said it.
I'm just curious.
No, I certainly understand the question. I'm not surprised that you went in that direction. I'll give you the bigger part of the answer, and that is to say that I'm focusing on broader policy processes, including in these 4 decision points. I can extrapolate based on that, but extrapolating is not the same thing as commenting on my own specific experiences in my official capacity, which is a different. But you know me a little bit, so you can probably
Can I turn that to a sort of a policy and process question, though? I mean, to the extent that that the intelligence agencies exist to give good, thoughtful, intelligent options and analysis to policymakers so they can make the right decisions. Do you feel like that process is working well and has worked well with regard to, Ukraine and Eurasia over the last 20 years, or is it something that needs to be fixed better?
I hear some comments over there. Maybe Bob,
I don't think the intelligence community exists to provide policy options.
so there's a
The
change.
intelligence
Fix on the
community
on the terminology there. Please
Okay,
take it
okay,
on
not
board.
policy options, but sort of input into what could become options.
Input into the options. I'll just that's also part of the same. Really good question. The answers will emerge over time. I suspect. I'll just reference in this context that those who understand the broader picture in the region, and understanding the broader picture involves not just counting things, but understanding some of the intangibles when it comes to societies, cultures, histories, aspirations, some of these intangibles, which are difficult to impossible to quantify really, but play a huge role in the way that things come together and the outcomes of crises. I think those, and this is not just about any one particular agency, I think it applies to everyone, think tanks, academics, those who take into account that broader picture, the intangibles, tend to, I would argue, come up with a better understanding of what is going on and what is likely to occur. And in this case, I would like to just sort of do a quick nod to INR in the sense that INR is an element that has prided itself over the years. And I mentioned the nationality section, which I'm not sure necessarily existed elsewhere, let's say, but certainly has prided itself on developing real expertise, and there's no substitute for expertise.
Great. And then my current question is,
Then there are some other questions in the back.
talked about hoping this war will end in a military victory for Ukraine, but it will take some time. Do you have a sense of what might hasten us to that outcome? Is this more stepped up? I don't know if we can step up sanctions anymore, but I mean, we've heard that the Russian military has lost 6,000 pieces of equipment because of export controls and sanctions. Are those the sorts of things that are going to really, in fact, make the difference in the end? And then do you think, to what extent can China be prevailed upon in some way? Or at this point, do you think they're just really in it to help Russia as much as it can without inviting secondary sanctions?
Thank
That's
you.
my last question.
Thank you. I very much appreciate that. I will so not necessarily comment on the figure that you referenced, the 6,000. They've lost a lot, obviously, and certainly the sanctions aspect. To those who say sanctions are not working, have not worked, I would say that's a terrific example of why that's not true, including in the military sphere. But beyond that, I would say what it will take, just as a sort of my academic capacity, of course, just to underscore that. I think the formula of the Ukrainian will to fight, the Ukrainian capacity to resist, which is based in part on what the international community does to help Ukraine, hopefully in recognition of the fact that Ukraine is fighting for all of us, is a winning formula, especially when compared to what Ukraine is facing, and that is a Russian military that's not nearly as strong, as effective as perhaps people anticipated heading into this large-scale invasion by Russia of Ukraine. I think the Russian military capacity was overstated, and that's something to keep in mind for the future as well. It's one of the hopefully lessons learned. I think those who understand how things work and don't work in Russia knew that the Russian military the chances were relatively high that the Russian military was less than what it looked like in a number of ways. But anyway, that's the formula going. In many ways, that's the formula going forward, because the people of Ukraine are committed to fighting. They have no choice. This is a war of survival for Ukraine. For Russia, it's a war of choice, no matter what Putin says. And it's a question of the broader recognition of what's at stake, and that by itself should feed the extent to which there's support for Ukraine. On China, I won't say much because it's nowhere near a China specialist. But I would just say that overall, given the Russia-China dynamic that we see today, there's, on the Russian side of things, there's clearly a desire for China to be more involved and more supportive of what Russia is doing. I suspect on the Chinese side, there's a desire to maximize the relationship for China's benefit, of course, without getting too drawn into the Russia's war against Ukraine, because I think there's a recognition that it's a loser, frankly, in many ways. And then there's up to and including the issue of possible nuclear use, of which there's been a lot of discussion in the Russian nuclear use, which I can't imagine that the leaders in Beijing would necessarily be strongly in favor of, and rightly so, because this would be something that would be a challenge to the international community, the world order, to the extent that it exists. I don't want to overstate it, but also in the context of a nuclear a P5 member using nuclear weapons against a neighbor in the geographic center of Europe, and a neighbor that gave up nuclear weapons in return for something, if not guarantees, then assurances, and it would be in the context of a war of aggression. So that's not something that one wants to be associated with, I would think, and I would hope.
Great, thanks. Yes.
Thank you, Jay. Good presentation.
Thank you.
Bill Courtney with Rand Corporation. So looking back over 30 years in the West, it appears that we underestimated the growth and strength of civil society in Ukraine, the patriotism we've seen now. So it's not just the fighting capability, much of which comes out of the train and equip program since 2014, but society itself. And we probably also overestimate civil society, or in Russia, the erosion of civil society may have gone too far. Went further than we thought in the West. In the West, I think many people in the West didn't think Russia would ever come to a point like this. They thought that civil society would intervene somehow to keep Russia from becoming so aggressive, laws of oppressive at home. To some extent, Western policy toward Russia and toward Ukraine have their own assessments of those kinds of things. From your perspective, why do you think the West overestimated Russia and underestimated so much in Ukraine?
That's a great question. We could have a whole conversation about that. That alone, I'll attempt to answer. There are people in the audience who I'm sure would make terrific contributions as well. On the Ukrainian side of things first, underestimating Ukrainian civil society, I think governments, despite the rhetoric, including our government, are not very good at estimating civil societies in general. I think governments are much more comfortable working with other governments. It's much more concrete. Civil society involves a greater and a different kind of engagement for which we don't necessarily always have time. Without engaging as much as we could or should, we don't attain the degree of understanding necessarily of what's transpiring in a given society in terms of civil society. Ukrainian civil society specifically, those are generalities. Ukrainian civil society was there to begin with, going back, of course, even to the Soviet period in terms of the dissident movement. There were dissident movements actually just in Ukraine alone that emerged later as Green World and other sort of ecological associations, especially in the aftermath of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. There was, of course, always the national democratic aspiration in terms of seeking Ukraine's independence that you know well for a variety of reasons. Civil society was there all along, but it took a while for it to reach critical mass. And as it often happens, the critical mass was reached during the Kuchma administration based on the multiple and frequent abuses that we saw during that administration that sort of brought additional people into civil society, and critical mass was reached at the time. Because of our difficulties trying to help Ukraine help itself over the years in terms of reform and related challenges, there may have been a perception that civil society is not doing its part. The reality is that it was doing its part and then some. And of course, today, civil society is leaps and bounds ahead of the political class including in terms of fighting back against Russia, but also in terms of Ukraine's future. The broader answer there, by the way, is that by and large in Washington, with some exceptions, there was no real understanding of, no deep understanding of Ukraine, including Ukrainian civil society. On Russia, there was a lot of focus, but again, just like in terms of being wrong about Ukrainian civil society, people were just wrong. I think they overestimated, well, the post-Soviet Russian experiment, if you will, to begin with, including the role of Boris Yeltsin, the supposed advance of democracy, the anticipation that somehow once Soviet communism is gone, that they'll become like we are, but Europe, they'll just join Europe and be good Europeans. That certainly wasn't the case, and it was true of Russian civil society today. And I say that very carefully in the sense that there are prominent, brave individuals who continue to fight for a better future for Russia. And I hope, I cannot say that they will prevail. I hope they will prevail because I think it's better for the peoples to be more accurate of Russia and for Russia as well. But there was just a lot of misunderstanding, a lot of wishful thinking, frankly, that developed in some administrations early on more than others, and that has had its frankly debilitating effect as well.
Okay, great. Let's see that. Yes.
William Risch, professor of history, Georgia College. I really appreciate the overview of your book. I guess one of the case studies for me as a historian is important is the Orange Revolution, and also this concept of the post-Soviet elite as compared to civil society. We've talked about civil society, but one of the problems is that civil society constantly has to deal with post-Soviet elites, not just at the national level, but the regional level. To what extent do you deal with, in the Orange Revolution as a case study, for example, the regional elites? Because I think of, besides the Orange Revolution that was going on in Kiev, the Severodonetsk conference that was in Severodonetsk that toyed with the idea of separatism, where the governor of Kharkiv region said, we can bring in our Russian troops in a couple of hours.
Indeed. No, thank you for that question. I do not spend a lot of time on the regional aspect just because I had other priorities in the book, but what you bring up is a very important consideration because regional elites played a certain, especially in the case of Eastern Ukrainian elites, played a certain quite negative role as well. And after all, Yanukovych came out of that environment as well. He was quote unquote governor of Donetsk Oblast. I say quote unquote because those positions were very much they went away from elected governors, as you know. So very much part of the narrative, the Severodonetsk, Siversko-Donetsk, if you want to use the ultimate Ukrainian form. Yes, that conference was very interesting because it was almost a dry run. It was almost a dry run for what transpired later in 2014. And I would say it happened in part because the Ukrainian government, it was easy, under Yanukovych, there was no hope of removing those influences from the Ukrainian political space. But essentially, these were what ended up being, as you can see in the east of the country, especially today, so internal enemies who were doing the bidding of Moscow and were not really, did not buy into Ukrainian statehood in any meaningful way. Part of the problem, there's a broader problem here, and that is how elites are generated. And one of the challenges in post-Soviet Ukraine, but not just, is that there are now, I would argue, especially in the volunteer movement and others. But before, there were no meaningful ways in which new elites could be generated from the bottom up. Whether it's civil society that has access to practical experience, in terms of governing, I should say, they have plenty of experience in other respects. Whether it's local leaders who can be beholden to the voters as opposed to beholden to the corrupt regional elites who sort of engineered their elections into those positions. So that's just something to keep in mind. And hopefully one of the benefits of the tragedy that we're seeing unfold in Ukraine today because of Russia's aggression is sort of Ukraine crossing the Rubicon, the point of no return in terms of generating new elites and a truer break with the Soviet past, because I continue to say in various lectures that the collapse of the USSR is still ongoing in a number of ways.
Okay, we're pretty much out of time, but we can fit in one very brief final question. Yeah.
Thank you, Gene. I'm Colin Cleary. I'm an adjunct in the political science department and former foreign service survey. I'm just wondering, I want to dial the time clock back to the very first year or two of the W. Bush administration. And the question is, did Vlad have to be bad, or did we, help play to his worst instincts? And people will note that in the early years, everybody knows, he was cooperative on the Afghanistan, and he seemed to, he went down to Texas at some point, he seemed to eat a barbecue and rode with the Queen in the carriage at some point. The point being, like, he looked like he was trying, right? The things that we could have hoped perhaps at that time. But did the W. Bush administration, they pulled out of the ABM, which mattered to them. They blew off Russia on the Iraq War. They did the Iraq War, which is the war of choice, and the Russians will draw the analogy of a war of aggression that you think you're threatened, so you can then unilaterally decide you're going to invade another country and take down the government. That's exactly what he thinks he's doing. So if you look back at U.S. policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, but even just more generally, I'm not saying we made him what he is, but did the W crowd play to his worst instincts and help him feel more comfortable in those worst instincts instead of the other pull that might have, maybe there was a push and pull. Obviously, since the 2007 Munich, he's announced his hostility and antagonism. And I'm sure you mentioned the Orange Revolution. So it's at least probably since 2004, he's probably been a lost cause. But was there a little window there for a couple of years? Maybe did it have to be as bad as it is now? Or was it inevitable that when he got powerful and had the oil money and had been in power for 20 years, he was going to do something with this?
So a nice small question for about 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay, very quickly. Thank you. I appreciate, Colin. Good to see you. I appreciate the question. The barbecue aspect reminded me of one drop of it and drinking cognac, and whether and you said looks like he was. Looks like is maybe a operative phrase there. I'm not gonna argue about Iraq because one can put together those reference points that you did. And construct a reasonable explanation up to a point. We didn't attempt to annex Basra. Iraq at some point invaded another country. Ukraine didn't invade anyone. So the parallels fall away very, very quickly, as you know. But I would say it can be part of the explanation. It's not the whole explanation. I suspect Putin, being a late Soviet era person with a particular, I say this carefully, mindset, reference points, I think he was predisposed to certain outcomes over time. So I would just keep that in mind. And even on the CT cooperation, yes, I'm aware of the phone call and all of these other things. I'm convinced that it wasn't done simply because he wanted to be there for us. He probably saw that he could influence the then President Bush in a way that would curry favor with the United States on obviously a very important issue, no doubt about that. And then perhaps get more maneuver room in terms of the post-Soviet space and address some of his at least then emerging agenda in that context. So I wouldn't give him too much credit. Could we have influenced him more positively in the margins? Possibly. I'm not sure that the outcome would have been all that different.
Okay, well, thank you so much for leading us on a fascinating discussion, and congratulations on your book. I hope it gets all the readership that it deserves.